Welcome to the Food and the First World War in the Hudson Valley webinar. I'm Carolyn Beneglauda, librarian for Education and Outreach at Southeastern New York Library Resources Council. And in a moment, I'm going to turn our webinar over to today's presenter, Sarah Wassberg Johnson. She is a museum professional and food historian. And through her work at the Hudson River Maritime Museum, she has been an active contributor to New York Heritage and Hudson Valley Heritage before that. So she holds an MA in public history from the University at Albany, and fun fact, we both graduated from that department at the same time, but never had the privilege of having a class together. So I'm very glad to be sharing this virtual space with you now. Before we begin, I wanted to give you an introduction to the Zoom webinar software, which is slightly different from the Zoom meeting software. Of note, only the panelists, which is the staff at Southeastern, and Sarah, our presenter, have microphones and video enabled. So you can't see the names of the other attendees. So with that in mind, if you're interested in saying hello, we welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat by letting us know your name and where you are from. And you're welcome to do that now if you'd like. There are over 150 people registered today, and we come from all over New York State. Many of you are from the Hudson Valley, but there are some people from other parts of the state as well. And we have people from all of the library types: academics, public schools, and special libraries. I think there's even some hospital libraries, and of course, cultural heritage institutions represented here today. And we have all different types of library workers represented as well. Now that you're getting used to the chat, I just want to point out two options. One is that you can write to the panelists only, which is a good way to ask for tech help. And me or someone else from the staff during the presentation can help you out. You can also chat to all attendees and panelists, which is how you join the full conversation, which is where people are introducing themselves right now. If you have a question that you would like Sarah to address, I welcome you to use the Q&A feature below. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation for questions that weren't addressed during the course of Sarah's talk. And so Sarah's not going to be monitoring the chat. I'll monitor it for her so she can just pay attention to her presentation. And we just want to let you know what you type won't be recorded with the recording of the video, but it is public and we'll save a copy of it locally after the event. And we trust that you will conduct yourselves in a way that is courteous to the fellow attendees. Anyone who uses the chat in an abusive or threatening way will be removed from the webinar. So thank you for that. As a reminder, like I said, we'll be recording this, and we'll also make the slides available to you after we have everything uploaded to the web on our website. And as soon as those are available, we'll email them to you. In addition, we'll have CE certificates available upon request, and keep an eye on the chat. I'll drop a link to the request form and a course evaluation at the end of the webinar. And with that, I want to thank you again for being with us here today and for all the work that you're doing to keep libraries vital and relevant. We truly appreciate your work. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Like Carolyn said, I am a food historian and a museum professional. And this topic for today is actually near and dear to my heart. I am writing a book on food in the First World War in New York State. So we will be talking a little bit about some other parts of the state, but I thought I would focus on the Hudson Valley because it's first, any lurk. And I've been studying this topic for about 5 years now. So if you have questions, like Carolyn said, you can drop them in the Q&A. If I notice them, I'll answer them on the fly. Otherwise, I'll answer them at the end. But I sometimes forget that not everybody knows the same stuff I do because I've been studying this so deeply and for so long. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I thought we would start with the cover slide is from a Liberty Bond parade in New York City. And it's this great image of Farmerettes, who we will get to. But there was a lot of stuff going on with Farmerettes in New York City environs and the Hudson Valley. So, and it's just a great picture. So I thought we would start with that. All right, so because this is a group of librarians mostly and historians today, I thought I wanted to talk a little bit about digitization and how important it is for people like me who are independent historians. In my opinion, digitization democratizes history by making or primary source resources readily available to a whole host of people, including independent researchers, students, journalists, members of the public, and basically anybody who doesn't get paid by university to do research, or in my case, necessarily have a lot of time to go visit archives in person. And I didn't list it here, but it is also important in times of social distancing, or if historical societies or libraries are closed to the public. Digital resources help people continue to do research, even in global pandemics. So I am also going to have these next two slides at the end, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about where I found a lot of these things. I do a lot of research online primarily, although I have visited some archives and taken lots and lots of photographs, which I then store on my computer and review later. Newspapers have been very important for my research. Obviously, Chronicling America, which is a project of the Library of Congress, has been helpful. I'm sure many of you are familiar with FultonHistory.com. Not the easiest to use, but there's a lot of the smaller, sort of more obscure New York newspapers on there. And then, of course, hrbh.org. Propaganda posters and photos are also extremely helpful. The Library of Congress and the National Archives have digitized a ton of stuff. Oh, I don't know why scrapbooks is on there, sorry. But there's also a couple of other references. And then in particular, scrapbooks have been very helpful to my research. As Carolyn said, I graduated in 2015 from the University of Albany, and it actually took me a couple of years to finish my last thing that I had to do for my degree, which was to write a master's thesis, which I did based on a scrapbook I found at Museum Village in Monroe, New York. I have also since looked at scrapbooks from Erie County, the Erie County Historical Society, History Center, and also the New York State Archive. And then there are also a couple of other food-specific things that have been very helpful, including cookbooks, cookbooklets, pamphlets, periodicals, things like that. Obviously, all the usual suspects there, except for the Cornell Home Economics Archive has been extremely helpful. And also the United States Department of Agriculture Library has digitized a fair number of things and put them online as well. And then just to give you kind of some reference to some of the organizations that are specific to New York State and the Hudson Valley, you're going to see me talking about a number of these groups as we go through the presentation today, the most important being the Orange County Food Preservation Battalion, which is the originator of that first scrapbook that I based my master's thesis on. There's also the Long Island Food Reserve Battalion. The National War Garden Committee and the Women's Land Army were both involved in gardening and agricultural labor. And then, of course, there's also New York City and state organizations and federal organizations, specifically the United States Food Administration, which we'll get to. All right, so now we're going to dive into talking about food in World War I itself. So I figured we would start with just a basic overview of the First World War. It starts in Europe in 1914. You want to get a whole picture of how it starts, I highly recommend Doris Kearns Goodwin's The Guns of August. It's an oldie but a goodie. The Sinking of the Lusitania is in 1915, and this is a preparedness propaganda poster. Based off the sinking of the Lusitania, there was a group of people, particularly in New York State, led by then former President Teddy Roosevelt, who thought that getting involved in the war was inevitable and that we needed to be prepared. So there was a big push after the sinking of the Lusitania to get the United States involved in the Great War, as it was known at that time. But that push largely failed until the Zimmermann telegram, which was a telegram from the German ambassador to Mexico, basically promising Mexico a whole bunch of stuff if they would invade the United States. That freaked people out a lot in the United States, and when that became public, essentially we decided to enter the war on April 6, 1917. Sorry. So one of the first things that Woodrow Wilson did, because he understood that food was going to play a very crucial role in this war was that he created the United States Food Administration by executive order and appointed Herbert Hoover as head of that organization. So because he creates it by executive order, it's an unfunded mandate, essentially. Herbert Hoover had become famous in the United States for his work in London and in Europe on Belgian relief. He created the Committee for Belgian Relief. Belgium had been invaded by Germany on its way to France. There were pretty horrific conditions there, and the people of Belgium were starving largely, and no one was helping them really. So Herbert Hoover, as a wealthy mining engineer, an American expat living in London, organized the Committee for Belgian Relief and really made a name for himself in efficient and highly effective organization of large amounts of food relief in kind of complicated political situations. So Woodrow Wilson brought him over, or rather he came over and sort of convinced Woodrow Wilson that he was the man for the job, and he was appointed as the Federal Food Administrator. So the reason why this is an executive order and not a law passed by Congress is that Woodrow Wilson really wanted sweeping powers for the executive branch and the United States Food Administration, basically the power to regulate anything and everything related to food in the United States. And there were a number of Congress people who really opposed that. So the act that funds the United States Food Administration, which is known as the Lever Act, is not actually passed until August of 1917. So they kind of have to do things a little differently until then. So from late April until August of 1917, Herbert Hoover and Woodrow Wilson rely on voluntary efforts, which is why I put their coercing cooperation, right? There's a lot of peer pressure that they put to bear. And Hoover really believed in the importance of voluntarism. He had seen some of the negative effects of bureaucracy and mandatory rationing in Europe. He did not want to see that in the United States. And also just his personal philosophy was that an able executive could do a lot better work in working with business and getting people to do things voluntarily. And also by engaging in voluntarism, sort of proving that the United States was better than everybody else, essentially, which is going on a lot at this time in the US. We're still sort of a young country. We're not really a world power, and we have a lot to prove on the world stage. So the US Food Administration also enlists the help of home economists. This is a fairly new career path for a lot of women. And essentially it professionalizes food production in the home and sort of the management of the home with assistance from academically trained authorities known as home economists. There's also a little bit of contention going on here. So you might be asking why Woodrow Wilson doesn't simply mobilize departments that already had a lot of say in food policy in the United States, like the United States Department of Agriculture. And that in part is because both Wilson and Hoover did not want to sort of create bureaucratic bloat that would exist after the war. So part of creating the United States Food Administration was that, I think, what's the phrase? Hoover writes something about he wants the seeds of its own destruction to be built into it. So it's designed as a temporary war emergency organization and not a permanent federal organization, which the USDA is actually not very happy about, and the head of the USDA and the head of the Food Administration, Herbert Hoover, sort of butt heads a lot over the course of the war, but that's why it's a separate agency. All right, so this is really why the Food Administration is created. It says, our problem is to feed the Allies this winter. Sorry, let me move my thing here. By sending them as much food as we can of the most concentrated nutritive value in the least shipping space. These foods are wheat, beef, pork, dairy products, and sugar. Our solution is to eat less of these and more of other foods, which we have in abundance, and to waste less of all of these foods. So when we entered the war in April Most of the United States had already planted their crops for the coming year. And the reason why wheat is on this list is multifold. Let me see if I'm, nope. But it is in large part because the prior 2 years of wheat harvests in the United States and also in South America were not very good. Basically, our 1916 wheat harvest gave us just enough wheat to feed ourselves. There wasn't really any left over for export, which is a problem when our allies need basically every scrap of food we can send their way, particularly when German U-boats are sinking ships, right? So it sort of says on this propaganda poster already, the most concentrated nutritive value in the least shipping space. And at the time, the conventional nutrition wisdom of the time was that carbohydrates, proteins, and fats were what we knew best in nutrition science at this time. A lot of vitamins, we were sort of figuring it out, but we didn't really understand the role of vitamins. A lot of people thought that fruits and vegetables were good for dietary fiber, but didn't really have a lot of other value. And it was really home economists and food scientists who were just sort of starting to trickle the science behind vitamins, which weren't even called that at that time. It wasn't until the 1920s that we get that term. But you see references to like mineral salts or, you know, important food values, things like that. That's what they're talking about when they're talking about vitamins. But not everybody knew that at that time. So that's why we're focusing on these particular items. So as I said, Herbert Hoover, big fan of voluntary rationing. I went over the harvest situation a little bit, but also Europeans, most European food cultures are based on wheat bread, not on corn, which they actually emphasize Americans eating more corn because we have cultural background to eat corn, and also the milling facilities. They did not have that in Europe. So both wheat and bolted white flour are both very shelf stable and easy to transport, and also very crucial to European consumption. Calories are relatively new at this point, at least as they were applied to food. Calories are a unit of heat measurement that were invented in the 1830s, but in the 1890s and early 1900s, a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania named William O. Atwater started applying them to humans and how humans consume and burn food, right? So these are all very high calorie foods. As I said, they needed to be shelf stable. And the voluntary rationing, so for ordinary Americans, none of this was required, right? They sort of came up with some ways to sort of make you do what they wanted to, but no one was coming to your house to see how much wheat flour you had, or if you were eating meat, right? Because that would have been an insane amount of bureaucracy to manage that. But there was a lot of peer pressure to get people to conform. So yeah, we're just gonna keep going. Going back to wheat, this is one of my favorite propaganda posters. And you'll see why a little bit. It says, will you help the women of France save wheat? They're struggling against starvation and trying to feed not only themselves and children, but their husbands and sons who are fighting in the trenches. So we joined the war fairly late, right? And if you study World War I military history, there's a lot of controversy about, you know, we kind of swooped into the last minute and saved everything, but there's some debate among historians about how effective our troops were, sorry. But the impact on people in Europe, particularly in invaded Belgium and France, was especially harsh. And this propaganda poster is important for a number of reasons. For one, it's very emotional, right? Here are these French peasant women struggling. They're pulling a plow because they don't have any draft animals, right? They're trying to farm to feed not only themselves, but their husbands and sons who are fighting in the trenches, right? And this is a time we're still coming off of the Victorian era. And people have particularly American white, middle and upper class, people had very particular ideas about what women, especially white women, should and should not be doing, and hard agricultural labor being substituted as draft animals is something that would have been very shocking to a lot of white middle and upper class people. Not so much to people of color and farming families, but those are not necessarily the people being influenced. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So this is based on a real photo. You can debate whether or not it's staged, but this is from the Library of Congress. It's taken circa 1917. And it's French peasant women plowing in the Somme district. The retreating Germans have taken all livestock. Right, so my inclination is that this probably is not staged, but it's hard to tell. And you can see, even if you look, the woman in the center, you can see her plaid petticoat, and they recreated that in the propaganda poster, which is, I think, is excellent. So it's just a great example. And then quite recently I found this, which is from the Poughkeepsie Eagle News. So here is the Poughkeepsie Eagle News' interpretation of this image. It says, heroic women of France. The women of France must be enabled to hold up the morale of the French soldier until next spring. The morale of the house decides the morale of the soldier in the fighting line. We can do this by giving them the greatest freedom in their food supply, and of this, wheat is the chief factor. So here is a local newspaper in the Hudson Valley using this photograph, not the propaganda poster, but the photograph, to sort of convince people to eat less wheat so that they could help these poor women in France. This was actually a very good find for me because it's from March of 1918, which actually dates the photo to 1917, which I didn't know until I found this newspaper article. So that was great for me. Oh, come on. There we go. So lots of great propaganda around food saving and food conservation. So here we have Save a Loaf a Week, help win the war. Fats are fuels for fighters, right? So save your fat. Here are a bunch of men in the trenches, right? In the winter, it looks like. Get behind our soldiers, sailors, and our allies. Send them the most food possible in the least shipping space. Do it by eating less meat, beef, pork, fats, and sugar. And so this is an image of, what's the word I'm looking for? Ocean-going vessels, right? Taking food stocks across the Atlantic to Europe. All right, so sugar. Sugar was the only foodstuff that was rationed for ordinary Americans. It was voluntarily rationed and not rationed at all for canning, but in the fall of 1918, sugar was officially rationed in the United States. You had to have a card that tracked how much sugar you purchased, and there were restrictions in how much sugar you could purchase at a time. And I put Cuba on here because this is an example of sometimes the bigger picture stories that you can make connections to. So sugar was rationed in part because our supply was not great and because the need for the Allies was very great. So sugar is largely produced from sugar beets in like Poland and the Ukraine. So that's not available during the First World War. The British Empire got sugar from India. We produced it here domestically, largely in Louisiana, and also some sugar beet production, but cane production in Louisiana. And then we would also purchase from the Caribbean, and Cuba was a big producer of sugar. And we, as a nation, sort of leaned on Cuba, and the United States purchased their entire sugar crop, not really on the open market and not really for open market prices, which were very high. And there was some controversy about this in the period. There were some newspaper reports about, Cubans not having any food because they were producing sugar, and then we bought all their sugar for not very much money, and then they couldn't buy food. But these are some of the machinations that were happening around managing the global food supply in favor of the United States and its allies. So they did try to get people to eat way less sugar. They didn't always have great success. This This is another one of my favorite images from the time period. It says, for your beverages, 400 million pounds of sugar were imported in ships last year. Every ship is needed to carry soldiers and supplies now. So here is this very well-dressed young white woman holding a very large soda fountain beverage with a straw. She's in a big city, and across the water from her is war-torn Europe. There's a soldier shouting, hurry, for the ships coming across, but her sucking on this soda fountain beverage is turning ships away from the supply line back to her, and the ships that she's turning away say sugar on them. So I thought this is a very striking image that they use to try and get people to consume less sugar. Americans consume more sugar per capita at this time than anybody except for the British. And a lot of that had to do with the temperance movement, right? And the rise of soda fountains and tea rooms and things like that, where we're drinking sugar-sweetened beverages, we're eating candy and cakes and ice cream at sort of a prodigious rate. So getting people to change their habits was a little bit of an uphill battle at that time. Another way to free up food for the Allies was to get people to waste less food. And part of the push for this comes from sort of, I'll say, the discovery during the progressive era among progressive reformers of statistics and the power of, you know, they would say things like, oh, if everybody ate one fewer slice of bread per day, we would save millions of pounds of bread. So statistics played a large role in communicating and understanding food waste, and getting people to think about, oh, well, you might just be wasting this little small thing, but if everybody acted like you did, you know, it would add up to a lot. There was also the issues with shipping, right? The more food that is wasted, the more has to be shipped in. There was some sort of propaganda around getting people to be more careful in their shopping and their deliveries. We're kind of going back to that a little bit now. Like at the time that we entered the war, women in urban areas in particular, you could order food delivered from just about anywhere, but that used up a lot of resources, and so they were asking people to waste less food to save on those resources. And also there's sort of this, you know, progressive white Protestant work ethic, which involves thrift. So you're considered a thrifty housekeeper if you can minimize or eliminate food waste. And there's also a fair amount of propaganda about the thrifty French housewife whose skill in the kitchen means she can make something out of nothing. So they talk about stocks and saving every crust of bread and things like that to free up food for soldiers and our allies. There's also, related to this is another favorite, the gospel of the clean plate, right, about food waste. And so that has to do, there's kind of this weird dichotomy going on of like, eat all of the food on your plate, but also don't be a glutton, which again is the very progressive era Protestant work ethic kind of thing. You're making a moral statement about how people are eating. And then also, if you grew up hearing, eat everything on your plate, children in other countries are starving, here's literally where it starts. Leave a clean dinner plate, take only such food as you will eat. Thousands are starving in Europe, right? That sounds familiar. And again, here are a couple more posters tying it directly to World Relief, the greatest crime in Christendom, right? So if you waste food, you are selfish and awful. People are starving. Definitely not subtle, a lot of this propaganda, but this is also among the first time ever in American history that the United States government was directing propaganda at its own citizens to try and change their everyday behaviors. So, all right, we also have, in order to free up food supply, we have the creation of war gardens, which toward the end of the war got retermed victory gardens, which is a term that was recycled in World War II. Charles Lathrop Pack was a forestry fortune heir, right? He had a lot of money, but he was very interested in gardening and agriculture. And he founded the National War Garden Commission, which is a private voluntary organization funded by PAC that really promoted war gardens and was also influential in creating the US school garden movement. So gardening and sort of back to the land movement was already happening at this time. School gardens, you know, children's canning clubs, pig clubs, things like that were sort of already around before the war. But PAC and the National War Garden Commission sort of capitalized on all this information to get people to grow their own. And one of the things he talks about in a number of his writings is that food that you grow yourself doesn't have to be shipped anywhere, right? So again, we're talking about sort of the larger points of saving not only food for shipment, but also saving other resources, including railroad shipments. So New York was the sort of railroad hub and port hub for export across the Atlantic to Europe, everything from troops to war materials to food. And in the winter of 1917, 1918, we actually had really bad weather in the United States and the railroads practically shut down. And that was a huge problem. So here PAC is saying if you're growing your own food, you don't have to worry about whether or not railroads are going to bring it to you. And you also free up railroads to deliver other things elsewhere. And war gardens, that was a national movement, but I haven't done quite as much research on this as some of my other topics, but they definitely were everywhere and they were all over the Hudson Valley and in New York. So we have some images. This is from the United States School Garden Army. This is another great one. Uncle Sam says, garden to cut food costs. So this is from the USDA, sending out free bulletins. You can see they have two, one for city gardeners, one for farm gardens. And then just some local connections. This is a war garden exhibit from Newburgh by the Rotary Club. It's actually from the spring of 1919. So war gardens continue even after the war. But you can see the foods are arranged by where they were grown. So there was a garden on Broadway, one on Grand Street, and one on Liberty Street. And then this is another one, the Children War Gardeners Help the Suffering. So this is from, I think from Washington Heights in New York City. Yes, for the Washington Heights Hospital, #1. Again, school children doing some war gardening. And then these are both from the National War Garden Community Garden in Bryant Park in New York City. And I love these because they're colorized. And you can see it's not a very big garden. Looks like they kind of just dug up a section of lawn, but there's people looking at the information and learning about war gardens. And then this is a great spread from the Evening Telegram. 40 million army ready to swarm over America's no man's land, slacker area that aids Kaiser. So there's a picture of Charles Lathrop PAC all the way over there on the right. Trade school girls who have proven highly efficient as farmhands, right? And what they're talking about, no man's land and slacker area, those are both terms that were used to describe land that was not in production. So there was a real push in urban areas to take on public parks and public lands. A lot of companies also would not only give their workers paid time to do this sort of farm gardening, war gardening, but also if they had company land that was idle, rich people who lived on estates would give over their land to gardening. And then also people were encouraged to garden in their own yards. Okay, I'm just gonna take a little pause because it looks like we have some questions. Okay, so one question, why did people stop city food gardens? I think in part because they did not need to garden as much after the war, although again, that is revived during World War II to great effect, actually probably even greater effect than in World War I. But it's just cheaper and easier to get canned or frozen or from the grocery store, I think. And also post-World War II, we start to get much more nationalized grocery supply. So it's easier to get foods across the country. We have, we can get fresh foods delivered by air, right? Or we have refrigerated railroad cars, refrigerated trucks that can go much longer distances, things like that. And our food supply also becomes much more globalized after World War II. So we're not necessarily producing everything in our own country. And then someone also asked, is Newberg Garden slide on HRVH? So most of the stuff that I'm showing here today, I didn't cite everything, but if anybody has specific questions, I can tell you where I got it. That particular slide was, I believe, from the either Library of Congress or the National Archives. I don't remember offhand. But yes, if you have specific questions about any of the slides, I can dig up where I got them. Oh, and then James asks, in your research, have you encountered company food cooperatives for employees? You mean like purchasing cooperatives or cooperative gardens? So there is some sources. I haven't done a ton of research, but I have run across sources that mention a lot of company-sponsored gardens in vacant lots and things like that. But purchasing cooperatives, I haven't run across much in the First World War. Lots of agricultural cooperatives, not so much on purchasing cooperatives. Yes, okay. Community gardens on Grand and Liberty Street. Yep, I can definitely, well, the slides I think are going to be shared after the talk, but I can dig up that link and give it to Carolyn and she can share it with everybody too. All right, James, I haven't seen much on purchasing of bulk food. I can check and see if I have anything. And yes, yep, the posts are about buying locally, eating less fat, not wasting food, yeah, eating less sugar. Yeah, a lot of the nutrition advice from World War I and World War II is still very applicable to today. All right, I think that answered everybody's questions. We're gonna keep going. If I can click back on my thing here. All right, so related to war gardens is Farmerettes. So we featured them on my first slide. I love this poster. I don't know, the Farmerette and garden poster seems to me the most colorful, which is great. It says, "Get behind the girl he left behind him. Join the land army." Farmerettes actually really starts in New York, as far as I can tell, influenced heavily by the women's farm labor movement in Great Britain. The Women's Land Army of America is the official organization based again on its British sister organization, and it's tied very closely to women's suffrage, which is very interesting. I don't know why they decided agricultural labor was the best way to prove that women could do anything that men could, but that's the route that they chose. Also, the National Service League of Women was involved in women-led agricultural labor. And there were also farmerette movements outside of the Women's Land Army of America. The Long Island Railroad with Hal and Edith Fullerton, the agriculturists for the Long Island Railroad, had a little demonstration farm that used women labor. The Agricultural College at Farmingdale had a national service school for women that included training in agriculture for both men and women. And then there was a privately owned farm called Jonathan Farm in Westchester County that was also women's labor training. And then Ulster County, this happens fairly late in the war, 1918 into 1919 and 1920, but there were farmerette camps near Marlborough in Ulster County. And I think I found references elsewhere in Ulster County, but they're definitely in Marlborough. And I believe the Marlborough Library has a collection of photographs and information related to the farmerettes up there. So the YWCA also had a land service committee. It's just another great propaganda poster. People in the First World War were really into uniforms and having a specific uniform. So here these girls are wearing the specific uniform of the time. It's a little controversial They're wearing leggings or jodhpurs and a tunic. They are not wearing long skirts and they are not wearing dainty shoes. They've got boots on and it was often in khaki, right, with kind of a slouchy hat. So very similar in style and kind of reminiscent of men's military uniforms. So they would also do them in blue or khaki. So here's another couple examples. So another interesting program that starts in New York is the Farm Cadet program. So along with Farmerettes, we also had Farm Cadets. And this is explicitly to address farm labor shortages. So farmers actually tried very hard to get farm laborers and farm owners exempt from the draft. They were not successful. And there was a lot of concern about labor shortages and crops sort of rotting in the fields. Sound familiar? So women and teenage boys were mobilized to harvest crops. So it was called the New York State Boys Working Reserve. And the Farm Cadet program was a subset of that. It ran from 1917 to, I found a reference in Wyoming County of the Farm Cadet program in 1982. So Farm Cadet program is a long running program in New York State. It primarily recruited teen boys, although you did also have some Boy Scouts. They were exempt from schoolwork. They did some workarounds for high school boys so that they didn't necessarily have to take the Regents exam. They lived in camps. It was sort of billed as like a summer camp, even though a lot more work than a summer camp. And it was highly militarized in how they operated. And part of this other goal of the Farm Cadet program, that's why they use the term cadet, was that it was to get teenage boys used to military life, right? Because they might be called up into service. Obviously, that doesn't happen for most of these boys because we're only in the war for less than 2 years. But that was part of the goal behind it. Yes. And then this is from the New York State Archives. Boys, serve your country on the farms. Join the U.S. Boys Working Reserve. Right, so it did spread to other states, but New York State was an early adopter. And again, I'm not sure if you can tell in the background from that little drawing, but there's a boy who's pushing a plow with horses, and he's wearing a very similar style uniform to what enlisted men in the military were wearing. All right, so another way that food was preserved or freed up for the Allies and our soldiers was that people, oh, hold on, engaged in canning. We got a Q&A here. Okay, wondering if the farm labor shortage is impetus for the Great Migration of Blacks from the South. That is a good question. I think the Great Migration sort of starts to, I think it predates World War II, or sorry, World War I, although obviously it continues. And I think a lot of the Great Migration was for people to get involved in more industrial and manufacturing labor rather than farm labor. I haven't seen much evidence of Black people coming up from the South to engage much in farm labor. Lots of like working in brickyards and things like that in the Hudson Valley. But to my knowledge, not so much on farms. So I'm gonna say that question is answered too. Did the working reserves and cadets work year round, or were they just during the warm months of the crop growing? So it was spring to fall. They did not work during the winter. So they were let off school early in springtime to help with planting. Then they would stay through to fall harvest. Oh, so they encouraged vegetables. What about small animals, chickens, lambs, etc.? So chickens were definitely encouraged, and the New York State Food Commission, gosh, I'm forgetting his name, but one of their directors kind of famously said that there should be a pig in every home in New York. So he wanted people to raise pigs in their backyards. And that was sort of skewered a lot in the press in New York City, speculating about having pigs in New York City apartments. But yes, meat animals were encouraged for home raising, largely focused on chickens and pigs. But again, this is a fairly short-lived war, and it's easier for people to grow vegetables than it is for them to raise a pig. So, and also agricultural policies and food administration policies actually, what's the word I'm going to use, result in a meat surplus in 1918, which Herbert Hoover has to kind of scramble and get the Allies to buy it up because they've been telling people to not eat all of these things, including pork. And then all of a sudden we have a giant pork surplus, which doesn't look super great. So that is fascinating, Cheryl Ann, that your grandmother had chickens in her New York City apartment. That's crazy. I have not run across many references to that, but that does not surprise me in the least. All right, and James, if you could clarify your question. I don't really understand that. So, all right, we're gonna get back to canning here. Because, let me just check the time quick. Oh yeah, we got a ways to go still. So canning is something that I know the most about, in part because of the Orange County Food Reserve Commission, or sorry, Battalion, Food Preservation Battalion. Oh my gosh, it's so easy to confuse all of these long names. So the National War Garden Commission was also very involved in getting people to can the results of their war gardens, and they published a number of pamphlets about canning and drying and things like that. The USDA and the US Food Administration also got involved in disseminating information about canning, and community canning kitchens sprang up all over the state. In 1917, it's mostly voluntary organizations who are leading the charge. And by 1918, and this is sort of a bigger thing that's happening in a lot of different places, but specifically we're going to talk about canning. In 1918, the state starts to take over with official food conservation agents who work either with farm or home bureaus or with food administrators who were appointed by the state and federal government. And of course, they're all home economists, largely trained home economists. Oh, lighten up the Q&As here. Oh, Mary Burns has freezing not an option until. So we did have frozen foods. They were not very good frozen foods because they were not, it's kind of like if you were to freeze your own food in a chest freezer, right? They get sort of impacts the quality of the food. They get kind of big water crystals frozen in them. So it's not until Clarence Birdseye discovers flash freezing in the 1920s that we start to get frozen food being an option. Also, most people in the 19-teens did not have electric refrigeration at all. They had ice boxes for refrigeration, so keeping frozen food frozen was very difficult. We did also have during World War I an ammonia shortage, and at the time ammonia was one of the cooling gases that was used to freeze food and also make artificial ice and things like that. So freezing was not an option in World War I. Okay, thank you for clarifying, James, about your comment. Allison, I will answer your question about a good place to go for recipes at the end, so I will leave that one up. Oh, and James commenting about Gravesend, Brooklyn, and a truck farm having goats and chickens during the World War. That's awesome. Thanks for sharing, James. All right, so let's get back to canning. So these are, this is another one of my favorite propaganda posters by the National War Garden Commission. The poster is on the right, and the Victory edition of their home canning and drying booklet is on the left. And it says canned vegetables, fruit, and the Kaiser too. And the one on the right is my favorite. It says Monarch brand unsweetened. And it has Kaiser Wilhelm in there. And one of the things the National War Garden Commission did is they gave away all this stuff for free. Like you could right away and get a free pamphlet. And so they can say write for a free book. So their pamphlets are kind of ubiquitous. You can find them just about everywhere, including in the scrapbook of the Orange County Food Preservation Battalion. Here's another couple ones from the War Garden Commission. And this, the one on the right, is a little illustration from a booklet that also the War Garden Commission published called the War Garden Guide, but it's G-U-Y-E-D, just like guy in the 19 teens was sort of like a slang word for a foolish person. And it's a compilation of political cartoons and poems and songs, stuff all related to war gardening and canning and stuff like that. So this one says, let your fruit trees save sugar. So there's Mrs. Patriot's fruit tree with a little parade of U.S. preserves, right? That's a joke, instead of U.S. reserves. And the background is Mrs. Waster's fruit tree, and she looks all sad because there's wasted and rotting fruit everywhere. So just one of the little fun political cartoons that they put out about canning. And then this is a little graph that I put together based on my research of canning kitchens and their locations in 1917 and 1918. It's a little small because I got the whole state in there. But you can kind of tell, I mean, obviously I'm sure there were canning kitchens elsewhere, but these are the ones I found references to. And you can kind of tell that they tend to be along railroad lines, which we'll get to in a minute. So this is the Orange County Food Conservation Battalion, their canning kitchen at the Yelverton Inn in Chester, New York. That building is still there. It's now private residence. And the building itself actually dates back to the 18th century. Here they are inside, and you'll notice they're wearing all the same uniform. We talked about uniforms, but this is the official food conservation uniform. You could write the United States Food Administration, they would send you a pattern for free, so you could make your own. They're light blue with white collars and these big long white cuffs, and then a little hat, and they were designed as a house dress, so you'd wear them over your regular clothes. So there's women here, hard to tell what they're doing. I think they're shucking corn. There's a woman operating a slicer in the background. And then this is a United States Food Administration, oh gosh, I'm forgetting her last name. Her first name is Mina Van Horn, possibly. She's like one of the lead food conservationists for the whole country. And here she is. It's a little better view of her little outfit that she's wearing. Ooh, Lynn asked, were there issues with obtaining canning supplies, jars, lids, seals, etc.? So tin cans were in very short supply during the First World War. So you can see there's some glass jars there, mostly wire bale jars where they had a glass top and a rubber seal. Those were the most common at the time, although you also see there are some screw top ones, mostly zinc screw tops. So there were issues with that, and that is part of the reason why drying food was suggested as an alternative food preservation. But the glass jars were fairly easy to obtain throughout the World War, but the tin cans were not. And people did do some home tin canning, believe it or not. Okay, so this is my favorite thing that happens in New York, training by train. So in the Progressive era, people used railroad trains as a way of disseminating information to small towns and rural areas. And this image is from, I believe, the Library of Congress. And this is the Orange County Food Preservation Battalion ladies on their instruction train showing people information about canning. So there were a number in 1917, all kind of privately organized. I have them in chronological order. The Save the Surplus Special ran on the Lehigh Valley Railroad starting in April of 1917. The Special Instruction Train on the Long Island Railroad, organized by the Long Island Food Reserve Battalion, of which Ralph Peters, president of the Long Island Railroad, was president of. That ran in May, June. The Conservation Special on the Erie Railroad, organized by the Orange County Food Preservation Battalion, ran in July. And then there's also a Victory Special in Cornell with the Home Economics Department at Cornell that ran all over the state. And so in 1918, we talked about, we start with voluntary organizations and then the state kind of takes over. In 1918, the Victory Special runs all over the state. That's the only one that operates And then in 1919, it turns into the thrift special, and it still operates all over the state, again, run by home economists from Cornell. Ooh, Shannon. I actually haven't looked at the chalkboard behind Mina, but you can let me know when you get to look at the presentation afterwards, because I'm worried about the time, so I'm not gonna go backwards. So these are a couple of images. This, I believe, is from the Victory Special, one of the Victory Specials, again, from Cornell University. And this is what the interior looked like. There would be a lecture car, basically, which is like a typical passenger car, and then a lecture sort of booth set up at the front. They would also have open cars like this for demonstrations. And a couple of the voluntary ones also had childcare cars. So the Long Island ladies and the Orange County ladies both made allowances for childcare so that women who had children could still go and see the demonstrations and somebody else would take care of their kids. Okay, so that was the ways that ordinary people were encouraged to conserve food, and also production was increased, but we also had regulation of business. This is one of the first times in the United States that we really have broad-ranging powers of regulation of business, not only of food, but of a couple of other crucial things for war materials, such as the fuel and railroads. So the railroads were actually nationalized for a short period during World War I because we simply needed to control the movement of war material and goods. So the Food Administration, like I said earlier, the Lever Act was passed in August of 1917, which gave those broad sweeping powers to the United States Food Administration, and almost instantly they start regulating any business that has anything to do with food. Restaurants, hotels, railroad, grocers, any retailers, food manufacturers, all get regulated. We'll come back to farmers. So the way that they do this sort of regulation is that you have to be licensed, right? And if you don't follow the rules, that license can be revoked, either temporarily or permanently. You could report, for instance, restaurants for having sugar bowls on the table. Restaurants were not allowed to have sugar bowls on the table or to serve bread as an appetizer or a side dish during the First World War. And manufacturers also had to be involved in very stringent regulations. Probably the most stringent regulations were imposed on bakers and bakeries. There were very specific regulations about how much non-wheat flour they were required to use. There were some baker strikes related to this, but largely it was to follow the food rationing about, I didn't talk about this earlier, I should have, but there were specific rules about what foods you were supposed to eat on what days and what foods you were not supposed to eat on what days. So I had said earlier, meatless Mondays, that comes out of this. And there are, for instance, some restaurants or delis who, you know, on Mondays are serving ham. And one guy tried to argue that he didn't know ham was a meat. So there's definitely a lot of regulation that had not been happening previously that was happening during World War I. Farmers were not regulated in the same way as other food businesses, in part because the agricultural lobby, particularly from Midwestern states, was quite powerful, and a lot of Midwestern senators were opposed to Woodrow Wilson, and he kind of had to keep them on his good side. So the way that they kind of regulate the prices of agricultural goods, Hoover didn't want to actually set prices, but they kind of do a little dance that they end up controlling prices, in that the United States government becomes the largest purchaser of grain with the Grain Purchasing Board and sugar. So they end up kind of setting the price by default based on what they are willing to pay. And there's a couple other things that they do, but yeah, regulation. And I just love this. This is a placard that you would have to put up in your storefront if you violated the regulations. Another thing that they did to sort of prevent people from price gouging was, and they did this in New York City in particular, even before the war, they would publish fair price lists. So for like regular household goods, including food, what's a fair price for this? So if you go to a store and somebody is charging significantly higher or significantly lower than the fair price, you might want to report them or investigate a little bit. So you can see there's a spot official fair price list paste clipping from newspaper here. So in New York City, they would publish a new one each week, right? So they could put that up in their store. Oh, we have a question. I should have this for COVID. Yes, yes, they should have fair price lists. Oh man, there's actually, I just saw something today about food prices going up and I thought instantly about the high cost of living, which is what they called it at this time. Oh, and Sue has a comment. Post-World War I impact on local food production. Anecdotal. First migrant labor crews were primarily blacks, but who were recruited up from the South due to labor shortage. Young farm men returning from World War I and women who had worked in the factories opted for better pay in other industries instead of returning to the black dirt farms. So black dirt is around Pine Island in Orange County. Interesting. Yeah, I did not know that. So thank you for sharing, Sue. All right. Back we go. We're almost done. So after the war, we win. Obviously, Germany is defeated, but Herbert Hoover and Woodrow Wilson take the controversial stance of asking people to continue voluntary rationing of food in order to free up food supplies, not only for the Allies, but for defeated Germany. Of course, the war ends in November of 1918, which means it's far too late to plant crops. There's no crops harvested. So there's a long winter facing still war-torn Europe. Although our troops start to come back after November, a lot of American troops stay in Europe to help with the cleanup. And so President Woodrow Wilson says hunger does not breed reform. It breeds madness and all the ugly distemper that makes ordered life impossible. The future belongs to those who prove themselves the true friends of mankind. Save food, don't waste it, right? So this is the policy of the United States after the war, that we have to continue feeding not only our allies, but also our defeated enemies, essentially to stop the spread of Bolshevism, right? The February Revolution starts in February of 1917 in Russia as a woman's bread protest, bread riot. And so Americans saw what could happen, both in Europe and potentially in the United States. So making sure that people had enough to eat was a way to prevent the rise of Bolshevism and help shore up the spread of democracy, which was somewhat controversially why we entered the war, according to Woodrow Wilson. So yes, we had to rebuild Europe. The United States Food Administration is disbanded fairly quickly. They're disbanded by the spring of 1919. Although some of the state organizations do continue on for a little while after that, they are also fairly quickly disbanded. Herbert Hoover is the hero of the hour. People try and get him to be president. He says no. He continues with, he goes back to his food relief efforts, most notably for the 1922 famine in Russia, which is an artificial famine orchestrated by what becomes the communist government. He does obviously become president just in time for the Great Depression. And, you know, he tends to be vilified for the Great Depression, and a lot of the stuff he did was not great. But a lot of the stuff that he did to deal with the Great Depression, he did during World War I, and it worked. So I try not to blame him too much. And pretty much everything is over by 1920, with a couple of exceptions. So as I said, farmerettes continue into 1919 and 1920, but by the mid-20s, women's agricultural labor stops being a thing. Canning kitchens largely disbanded, but there are a couple that persist. The Syracuse Thrift Kitchen continues until after World War II, which is kind of interesting. And then, yeah, we go sort of right into the Roaring 20s. And a lot of the lessons that we learned in World War I, people used during the Great Depression, and a lot of it gets recycled for World War II. The farm cadets get revived. The Women's Land Army gets revived. Community canning kitchens get revived. Rationing and victory gardens and all these things that we sort of pioneered or beta tested during World War I, we refined during World War II. So here's a couple of propaganda posters about just sort of tug on everybody's heartstrings to get them to keep conserving food for relief efforts. So I'm gonna end not on a sad note, but on a funny note. This is one of my favorite cartoons. I have so many, you guys. I could have filled this presentation. It could have been so much longer. But it's the best man coming up to a wedding during World War I, and the best man says, "Hooray, I've gotten written permission from the food controller to throw 10 grains of rice after them," which is a joke about food conservation that maybe only I find is funny, but I thought it was hilarious. And this is from the New York Public Library. All right, so just a little revisit about sources. Digitization has been super important for my research. All kinds of stuff out there, not really very well organized, no finding aid for the whole internet, so you kind of have to find things as you go. And then just a review of some of the organizations. And now we can take some more questions if anybody has any more questions. Looks like I missed a couple. Oh, okay, yes, Allison, we'll go back to your question about good place to go for recipes at the time. So your best bet is to, Google Books is a great resource, and also the Cornell University Hearth collection, their home economics collection, have lots of cookbooks. There were a number of cookbooks published, but again, because it was a fairly short-lived war, most of them are in 1918. And there are also a number of pamphlets that are published by a number of government organizations. You can also check periodicals, like, for instance, the Cornell Home Economics Archive has the entire run of Good Housekeeping organized. So if you go to the 1917 and 1918 issues of Good Housekeeping, there's all kinds of recipes and stuff in there. So yeah, have fun, happy researching on that. David, yes, concise designs of the propaganda posters. Is there any sense of how effective they were at communicating to the public and influencing their behavior? How quickly were government agencies able to mobilize a coherent message back in the beginning of the 20th century? How does it compare to the ability of government agencies to mobilize and communicate right now? Is there any truth to the idea that agencies were able to move more quickly with typewriters than they are able to with computers during a pandemic today? What a series of questions, David. So the most interesting thing to me about World War I propaganda is that it's really a private-public partnership. So if you want to know more, definitely look up George Creel and the Committee for Public Information, because it's fascinating how they coordinated and kind of leaned on journalists to get information out there. They worked also with a ton of commercial artists. Charles Dana Gibson, you know, organizer of the Gibson Girl, originator of the Gibson Girl, was one of them. James Flagg, who creates Uncle Sam, was another one of them. And so they're using all of these experienced advertisers to sort of get these messages out there to the general public. I'll see if I can dig up some books for you to read. I don't know about typewriters and computers. I think in the progressive era in particular, compared to now, there was a much larger sense of trust in authority than there is now. I think that's a real issue today. So there was trust in government, trust in corporations, trust in the media, trust in science and expertise that I think today, I mean, definitely there were still anti-intellectual movements in the time period, don't get me wrong, but the general public was a little more trusting then than it is now. In part, I think because advertising was kind of in its infancy and we have a lot more experience now in our daily lives with dealing with advertising. But yes, definitely look up George Creel and the Committee for Public Information. There's some really interesting stuff that you can dig up in there about the public-private partnership. Oh, Lori, when do you anticipate your book being published? Okay, so I've been working on this book for like 5 years, Lori. My goal, so I have a book contract with SUNY Press. I got my first manuscript back with peer review back in 2017, and then a bunch of life stuff happened. But I am now working on finishing all of my peer review related edits, and I'm hoping to have my manuscript done and to SUNY Press by the end of the summer. We'll see how that goes. It's a little tough working full time and trying to write a book and do all the research, but I'm pretty close. I'm pretty close. So it should be out hopefully next year. We'll see. We'll see. But if you want to see some of my writing that's I've made available to the public, you can go to my website, thefoodhistorian.com. You can follow me on Facebook. I post all the time on Facebook, all kinds of interesting articles and stuff like that. So yeah. Are there any other questions, or does Carolyn want to take back over? Let me stop sharing my screen, I guess, so Carolyn can come back on.
I don't want to take over. That was great.
Thank you.
But I will. I'm just going to let everybody know in the chat. I'm just dropping again the links to the CE certificate request and the evaluation. And if anyone's watching this recorded, it'll be on the website and in a follow-up email that everybody will get in the coming week. Sarah, thank you so much for that. It was great.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, and it was cool. I have been rationing my lunch all day. I'm sure there's a lot of other people here who are, you know, getting hungry. So thank you for that. I am going to go ahead and stop the official recording now since we've run out of Q&A. So thank you, everyone.